It's even beyond thinking about how do we make sure our assessment practices are equitable and fair, but even more exciting, how can we use assessment to actually advance equity? And that to me is the really exciting piece, because it leverages assessment from something that measures effectiveness and provides opportunities for learning to actually a tool for increasing diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus.
Hello, and welcome to Student Affairs Now. I'm your host, Keith Edwards. Today, we're talking about the new book, Reframing Assessment to Center Equity. I'm joined by four folks who contributed to this great new resource, and I'm so excited to learn from each of you. Student Affairs Now is the premier podcast and online learning community for thousands of us who work in, alongside, or adjacent to the field of higher education and student affairs. We release new episodes every week on Wednesdays. Find details about this episode and our panelists or browse our archives at studentaffairsnow.com. This episode is brought to you by Stylus, the publisher of this book. Visit styluspub.com and use promo code SANOW for 30% off and free shipping on all of their resources. Today's episode is also sponsored by Simplicity. A true partner, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life with technology platforms that empower institutions to make data-driven decisions. As I mentioned, I'm your host, Keith Edwards. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a speaker, consultant, and coach, and you can find out more about me at keithedwards.com. I'm broadcasting from Minneapolis, Minnesota, at the intersections of the ancestral homelands of the Dakota and the Ojibwe peoples. Let's get to our conversation. I'm so excited to have all four of you here. Let's begin with some introductions and a little bit about you and your connection to assessment. And Ciji, let's start off with you.
Hey, thanks for having us. So my name is Ciji Heiser. I'm the Director of Assessment, Marketing and Communications at Western Michigan University. I also serve as an assessment evaluation coach for a company that really focuses on racial equity and healing, developing capacity coaching. So in my day job, I get to do amazing things like strategic planning and how do we embed equity in that work, or inclusion in that work, or diversity in that work. We usually try to pick one and focus on it, because if you achieve it, you've already done something great, right? Mm-hmm. So I get to do strategic planning, program evaluation, data viz, and general assessment work. And so with the marketing and communications piece, we really try to focus on inclusive communication, fostering belonging through all of the things that we share, and communicating with compassion. We also take really seriously our responsibility to convey the promise of student affairs and student life to students and parents, and how we demonstrate and keep that promise using evidence and evidence-backed practices. So that's kind of my day-to-day work. I have the privilege and joy of getting to intersect with equity through either centering stakeholders in my work. So I think about different initiatives like Men of Color initiatives, or first generation college student study abroad trips, and how I really worked with them to be co-producers. I just brought assessment expertise, but they got to design and co-create everything with me because it was their lived experiences that I was trying to measure and show to others. And so that was kind of the beginning of my equity journey. And now I think one of the biggest pieces of the equity and assessment journey is the Grand Challenges project that is focused on leveraging data to advance equity across the country. It's a strategic plan that is really focused on how do we help individuals grow, how do we help develop institutional cultures that value that intersection of equity and data, and how do we start to look at some national agencies like measurement tools and accreditation to keep pushing that idea of how you can use information to create more equitable outcomes for our students.
Yeah, awesome. I'm so glad you're here. And I think you mentioned that co-creation, which is, I think, a theme we're going to come back to here in a little bit. Joe, welcome. Tell us a little bit more about you.
Yeah, hi, everybody. My name is Joe Levy. I'm he, him, his pronouns, and I work as the Executive Director of Assessment and Accreditation at National Louis University, which is a medium-sized, private, not-for-profit, Hispanic-serving institution in the Chicago area. We have a couple campuses in Chicago, including one downtown. And within my role, the three primary areas underneath me are credit for prior learning assessment, assessment of student learning, both academic affairs and student affairs, and accreditation. And, they overlap a lot, especially in thinking about strategy and prioritizing and centering students. And, I very much take an approach with accreditation. I looked at Linda Susky's betterment mindset and betterment approach as opposed to a compliance mindset. And really, when we are thinking about betterment and centering quality assurance, then we're not necessarily looking to the external bar that's being set by somebody else, but really looking at putting our students in the center. What are their needs? How can we better serve them, and having that be our priority and kind of North Star. Then I had the privilege of working with Ciji. She's the chair for the Student Affairs Assessment Leaders Organization, and I'm one of the board members there, and have helped historically doing some professional development work, and currently lead our open course on assessment, which is a MOOC that we do every year, which is just an incredible experience to be able to work with thousands of people who just want to learn more about assessment and provide them with tons and tons of resources on how to do so. And over the past couple of years, the module that has gotten the most attention and most requests, and we've probably tried as hard as we can to keep it updated, is module 5 on critical approaches to assessment work. And it's been so great to be able to pull in information from the field and work to feed people's interest and give them practical examples of how to do this work.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And we'll get links to that and more information in the show notes for people to share. And I've seen that too in my work and consulting with different folks, and with the curricular approach with this equity-based assessment. Really, the interest level is so deeply there. People really want to connect that. Divya, thanks for joining us. Tell us a little bit about you.
Thank you for having me, Keith. Hi, everyone. I'm Divya Bheda, and my pronouns are she, hers. I am the Director of Education and Assessment at ExamSoft, which is part of the Turnitin family. I'm also an independent consultant and speaker and coach in higher ed. I've been doing equity work, social justice training for over a decade now, close to 15 years. I came to the US as an international student, and my lived experiences here as an international student, I already finished a master's in India in public relations and communication, came here, got a second master's in educational leadership, and then did my PhD in critical and social cultural studies in education with a focus on program evaluation. So that's my entry into assessment. I come from program evaluation. My lived experiences as an international student were made me realize that there's a lot that can be done around meeting students where they are at and where their needs are. And so my dissertation was focused on how to build responsive organizations. And so the idea of equity, the idea of social justice it's just been like, I've been exposed to it. And I used to read all this literature in my courses, and I'd be like, oh, that's what's happening to me. Oh, that's my lived experience. And here I have a name for it, right? Because before, otherwise you would internalize it and think, why is this happening to only me? Why is nobody else having an experience? Because I was one person of color in my program, or so there was a lot of, I couldn't find the people who were having similar experiences, so you internalize it. So I think I come to this whole experience of equity and assessment wearing that international student hat, and wearing my colleagues, like bringing my colleagues along, because I know even in today, there are lots of folks who do in student affairs, in the faculty arena, who do a lot of unpaid labor, right? Like there's unrecognized, unacknowledged labor around student success, around student development, around building equity, who don't get recognized, who don't have the time to write, who don't have the time to be present in terms of their voice. And so I just want to say thank you, because my influence, my thinking is influenced by their work. And so I kind of bring that lens to everything that I do. So thank you for having me again.
Beautiful. Welcome. Thank you. And Gavin, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, so I'm Gavin Henning. I use he, him, his pronouns. I'm professor of higher education at New England College, which is a small private liberal arts institution in central New Hampshire, where I direct our Master of Science in Higher Education Administration, as well as our Doctor of Education programs. Prior to my time being a full-time faculty member, which now I'm in my 10th year, it's hard to believe, I spent 20 years in higher ed administration, 13 of which were in assessment and institutional research. And really some of the what influences me in terms of this assessment piece is I've been doing assessment for a very long time, but I really learned more about equity when I became president of ACPA College Student Educators International, and realized as somebody who has a lot of privileged identities, what I didn't know. It was a huge learning experience. And so I had that background and had been doing the assessment piece. And then in 2017, when Eric Montenegro and Natasha Jankowski published a piece on culturally responsive assessment, that really opened my mind to this intersection and really excited me because it brought those two elements together for me. And then I've had the privilege of working with a colleague, Ann Lundquist, and I'm presenting on this topic, and even talking about it, and our thoughts have evolved over time. And we've had the opportunity to write a couple book chapters, as well as some articles. And then really a lot of that culminated in this book once we got connected with Eric and Natasha and Janita Baker and said, we really need to pull the folks together who are doing this work. And so that's really kind of the beginning of the genesis of that.
Yeah. Well, Gavin, as you just mentioned, you're one of the editors, along with some of the folks you just mentioned. Help us get a 30,000-foot view of this topic and this book. Maybe a little bit about the why, the what, and the how.
Yeah. So there's a huge diversification in college student population. We're seeing a lot more students from different ethnic and backgrounds, as well as adult students. But there really continue to be disparate educational outcomes. If we look at 6-year graduation rates, that's just one example. National Center of Education Statistics published some data in 2019 where 74% of Asian Americans are graduating in 6 years. For white students, 64%. For Hispanic students, 54%. Pacific Islanders, 51%. Black students, 40%. And American Indian Alaska Natives, 39%. And so huge differences. And then NCES also published some data in 2021 looking at some of the income levels. So for bachelor's level students, people who just have a bachelor's level degree, they make, the median is $55,700 per year. Compared to those who have just a high school degree, $35,000. So that's $20,700 per year difference. Imagine this over 10 years, that's over $200,000. Imagine this difference over a 40-year career, that's close to $1 million. And imagine being able to invest just some of that and how that would grow exponentially. And when we look at the impact of generational wealth on poverty and how poverty is very different for different ethnic groups, there's a huge impact that college graduation can have. And that's just one example. And so while colleges and universities have created some individual programs, such as bridge programs and mentoring programs to help create some equity and try to level out some of those outcomes, it really hasn't been working like we've hoped it would. And I think there's a really interesting opportunity when we look at assessment and equity, because assessment's never been connected to equity. They kind of evolve separately in higher education. And right now, when we talk with people and we say equity and assessment, they think about assessing DEI programs, diversity, equity, inclusion programs. And we're actually talking a little bit about even something broader than that. And it's even beyond thinking about how do we make sure our assessment practices are equitable and fair, but even more exciting, how can we use assessment to actually advance equity? And that to me is the really exciting piece, because it leverages assessment from something that measures effectiveness and provides opportunities for learning to actually a tool for increasing diversity, equity, inclusion on campus. And so there's a lot of opportunity there. And we're really excited about with the chapter authors, because they bring all of that to bear, all of their experience into that book with a lot of different examples and case studies. So that's kind of really, I think, the why and the what, and hopefully the book will share a little bit about the how.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a lot of really great theorizing and philosophizing, but also really great examples and case studies and recommendations and suggestions, and a lot of really new and innovative strategies. Divya, you wrote a powerful chapter in this why section called The Assessment Activist, a revolutionary call to action. I'd love it if you could tell us a little bit about equity in and through assessment, as well as your call for activism.
So the foundation for the chapter, Keith, is what Gavin was talking about, right? It's this idea that the bridge is our students' backs. Any progress that we make around social justice, around equity, whatever delays there are in that work is going to be impacting our students negatively. And so that is where that power, like there's a call to action, and that's what the chapter is all about. And when you ask the question about in versus through, if we are working towards assessment, towards equity, we have to have a strong understanding of what that is, right? And which means that we have to embed ourselves in the literature. There's so much of scholarship around this work. Black feminist scholars have been doing this critical work for years. And so we need to embed ourselves to understand that vision. What does, overlapping oppression look like? How systemic is it? What do we have to unpack in the way we are and in the way we practice and do things to be able to reach that goal of student success? And I like to define student success not just as student learning and graduation rates, but also the journey of education, right? Is a student having a good, positive, uplifting experience of the education system? And so so do we want to achieve equity as a goal? Then we need to understand all the nuances to that equity. We need to understand the literature that it's based on, that idea of equity. And the same thing when we think about through equity, like through assessment, we have to think about in our assessment practice, right? How are we making sure that that practice itself is equitable? So that when we engage in assessment, if our tools kind of, further entrench and reify the same things that we're trying to dismantle, then there's a problem, because we will never expose what needs to improve or what needs to change to achieve that goal that we're trying to achieve. So it's both and. We want to achieve equity, we want to work towards it as a goal, but we also want to embed equity and social justice principles in our work, which means for all of it, we have to intentionally have social justice in both. Building on that, I also wanted to share, so what I offer are some key ideas, and I think the foundation under it is intention. We have to be intentional in trying to find community and so this book is an opportunity for folks to come together, read it, build like learning communities, but find community of like-minded people who will hold us accountable. We want to organize intentionally, so it can't be armchair activism, right? We need to think through, okay, what do we want to change in our practice? What do we want to change in our climate survey, the way we do it? What do we want to change in terms of meeting introductions? What do we want to change in terms of the first class? What do we want to change in terms of student orientation, right? We have to be intentional. We have to accept that it's going to be recursive, because what we think is achieving equity may not achieve it. So then you'll realize, I made this mistake and actually it didn't work out the way I wanted it to work out. So we need to take 2 steps back, do it again. So it's going to be recursive. And we have to, I think, and different people have different viewpoints, but I think we have to own being an activist. And what I mean by that is that we are advocates for equity. Right? So we can't see ourselves only as assessment professionals. We have to see ourselves as equity champions. We have to see ourselves as doing that work. And only when we're able to say that or recognize that for ourselves, even if we are scared to say it publicly, because it's a very political environment right now, we will find like-minded souls, or they can find us. Because otherwise you can be alone and you may not be able to grow, because we only grow in community. So.
Well, for those of you just listening to this, you're missing the head nodding and agreement by your colleagues as you're going along, which is wonderful to see. And I'm hearing that equity and social justice is both a product and an endpoint, but also a process that we want to get there. And you're talking about activism and being strategic and being intentional and being thoughtful so that we're effective in our work getting there. So I really appreciate that call to action. I think anything less than a call to action, it really kind of undersells your argument in the case that you're making. Let's shift to talking a little bit more about the how. Ciji and Joe, you wrote about advancing equity through assessment. And help our listeners, folks watching this, think through how they can do this in their practice. I think many folks are listening saying, of course, or I've never thought about it like that. I'm really excited. Tell me what to do. So Ciji, can you help? What would be a good assessment practice? How can people put these brilliant ideas and perspectives and reframes into action?
Yeah, I just want to respond to a couple of things. So I was vigorously head nodding and physically restraining myself from being like, yes, I was really excited about what I was hearing. And I think that a couple of things. Like, yes, this practice has been happening for so long, maybe not specific to assessment in higher education, but there's 30 years of literature and lived experience in culturally responsive evaluation, right, from Black and Brown practitioners who have been doing this work all along. So we, in many ways, are standing on the shoulders of giants. And the Center for Culturally Responsive Evaluation and Assessment is out in Chicago. I would encourage anybody to look up their website. There's some fantastic projects like Nobody Knows My Name, where these two men of color actively dug back into the research to excavate the voices of women of color who had been contributing to the profession, kind of like we named earlier, where it was like, there are people who've shaped my journey along the way, and although they're not here, I want to thank them. So it's like a very formal way of that. And so it's very powerful and beautiful. And I also just want to echo the idea of our tools. And I think as practitioners, one of the things, and we'll get into more detail here, so I'm jumping ahead, but the tools and methods that you use either silence or uplift lived experiences and voices. And so when we're thinking about intentionality, this applies to standardized tools, right? Standardized tools were created by humans and grounded in research, but that doesn't mean that that research was conducted on diverse populations.
Yeah, not bias.
And the body, what?
Not bias free. It's not bias free.
Correct. And we really have this like draw to want to be apolitical and aneutral and subjective. And I think we really just need to like package all of that up and take it to somebody who can help us unpack it, because it's really in its tight little box. And we really need to disavow ourselves of some of those notions when it comes to assessment, especially when it comes to students in continuous improvement and equity. And so tools are really critically important. But to answer the how question, really want to start by reminding all of our listeners that good assessment practice really focuses on continuous improvement and asking questions that matter, right? So when we're talking about the intersection of equity and we're talking about the intersection of equity and assessment, we're not talking about in addition to assessment practice. We are just centering equity as that question or that continuous improvement practice that really matters to many of our stakeholders, especially when you examine the shifting demographics of the last 20 years of higher education students. And so we really want to encourage everyone to really think critically and engage in what was just named as intentionality, right? This intentional reflection about what's your power as a practitioner? What's your positionality and your lived experience as a practitioner? How does that shape the questions that you ask? How does that shape how students may or may not open and honestly communicate their authentic experiences with you? Right. How do you facilitate spaces that allow others to operationalize their agency? I can't give Joe agency, but I can create a space where he feels empowered to leverage and use his agency to advocate for change. How do you collaborate specifically with the people that you are evaluating their learning and trying to demonstrate learning? How do you work with the people most closely impacted by anything you might be looking to improve or change to get them to weigh in on it at every point in the assessment process? And how do you do this? And we've already talked a little bit about the methods, but how do you do this with the assessment cycle? How do you do this with strategic planning? How do you do this with program evaluation? So that's kind of one of the big things we want to encourage you to think about are these dimensions of power, positionality, agency, collaboration, methods. And so a concrete example is that when you are doing assessment work, you have the power to shape the narrative about what students' strengths are, as opposed to orienting that data and that report around student deficits. You also have the chance to leverage data to close outcome gaps and help your audience or your stakeholders hyper-focus on the work they need to do. You also have the chance to advocate for equity and student success, because oftentimes as the assessment practitioner, you are living with that data in a really intimate way. You are really embracing that data. You're spending a ton of time with it. You're reporting on it. You're looking at it from lots of different angles. And so I've had people say to me, well, who am I? Like, I don't run that program. Who am I to recommend action items? And I'm like, who are you not to? You have the most experience with that data. If you see a call to action that is clearly present from your analysis, then that needs to be one of your core points that you communicate with care, because you're communicating to another human who's done a lot of work, right? But that I view that as a responsibility of the role and the work. And so it's getting more specific about data collection and analysis. When you're thinking about the collection or the tools that you use, you really want to give critical thought to what will best showcase the student's experience and support decision-making. This is often where we start to hear that question about N, and I know Gavin has tons of thoughts here because we talked about this before, but if you are collecting data and you're trying to convey a sense of what a student who is transgender or transitioning might look like in the college environment, maybe you don't have an N of 500, or maybe you don't even know what your population in N is because you don't have a systematic way of collecting that on your campus. So maybe you follow that up, that quantitative data point, with a case study with a student who's willing to showcase their lived experience in a protected fashion, right? We want to keep their journey safe for them. We don't want to cause them harm, but how do you balance, right? How do you balance that desire for quantitative rigor with cultural responsiveness and that nuance of the lived experience? So we want to be thinking about the role of methodology in data collection and what impact that has on knowledge construction and how we report and interpret findings. And so we've named this real tension in assessment with respect to like bias and subjectivity, but sometimes when we pay too much attention to that, we run the risk of reinforcing dominant structures that have been shaped and maintained by privileged populations. So we need to start to deconstruct those structures. Specifically, really consider student culture in the selection of your methodologies. Ask them how they want to share their experiences with you. It's, they've grown up taking surveys, engaging in social media, right? Like they know our tools. It's not a surprise. It's not a secret, right? And so ask them how they want to talk about their learning. Ask them what they think will be the best way for them to showcase their learning to others. Ask them what will get them to reflect more deeply on what they're gaining, what tools they use. Is it a video blog? Is it a written blog? Is it a paper? Is it, what is it? What is it for you that works? Because it's really important. These choices shape who is heard and how knowledge is produced for larger audiences. And so any chance we can use methods to disrupt, dominant ideologies or perceptions around different groups, we should absolutely do so. Some concrete strategies is to, whenever possible, use mixed methods or multiple methods. Really pick specific outcomes, right? We're not trying to measure all things at one time using mixed methods. Pick something. Solicit feedback from the stakeholders who are at the center, or co-create with them if you can. Create paid boards of student assessment experts. And then, really start thinking about assessment plans. No report should go without recommended action items, and then you can, kind of co-create that action plan with whoever the departments are that you're working with. When we think about data reporting and sharing, again, this is where like power, positionality, and agency are all relevant for data interpretation. And especially when we're thinking about leveraging that data and who we're sharing it with to advance equity. So we want to consider the intended and unintended outcomes. We want to consider disaggregating data. You want to lean on your stats nerds. Like, I vote for anybody who's like a Katniss Everdeen fan. I volunteer as tribute. Like, stats are my friend. I love my stats. But reach out to your students who are like grad students and they just want to practice with some things. Really try to consider within and between group analysis, right? All like one Black woman's experience is not every Black woman's experience. And we do a bit of a disservice when we just keep naming things in that way. Like we disaggregated the data, but we stopped there. We didn't add any nuance. So when you can, reach out to people who have those more technical skill sets. And I would also say invite stakeholders to reflect on your findings. This doesn't have to be a focus group, but this can certainly be like, does this accurately capture your story? And have them weigh in, and they can provide so much nuance and explanation for the data as is. And I think it's always really important to be robust and transparent, and that goes back to good assessment practice. And then to promote action, as we named earlier, really position yourself as an advocate. Be brave. It is hard work, but you're already being brave by trying to encourage people to make data-driven decisions. All right, you might as well just do it to advance equity. And then be really inclusive of relevant populations as collaborators to help motivate action. And I'll stop there because I know Joe.
That's a lot of really great concrete suggestions. I think if you're an assessment professional, that can be great to integrate in your work. If you're not an assessment professional, but doing assessment as a part of your job, I want to encourage folks like find something, integrate it in, find something more, integrate it in. We want to avoid this perfectionist mindset where it has to be all or nothing, right? Integrate some of this in. Joe, what would you add here about some of the things that folks can use to better foster equity in and through their assessment, as Divya was calling on us for?
Yeah. Well, I would add, just going back to Divya's point, that we have this responsibility, and combining with what Ciji shared, assessment is about asking the right questions. And it's really important for us, given the history of higher education, the history of US society, that as we're operating with US-based institutions, to think about, well, who's asking the questions and what questions are, what perspectives are shaping those questions, and what students and identities perhaps are the default in mind, right? It's still interesting how a lot of times when people think of a college student, the default they have in their head is 18 to 22-year-old, when in fact, working adults have been the majority for years. And we still have many institutions that are still thinking of a certain identity and perspective in mind. And so we need to engage with our students, and we need to collaborate them to determine what are these critical questions, what are the ways in which we are recognizing diverse ways of knowing and learning, what are the ways we're not, where are we falling short, and how can we have guidelines for setting these priorities. I mean, Ciji mentioned earlier that one of the aspects that can stymie this work is where to start. There's so many identities. If we're going to disaggregate data, do we disaggregate everything? Do we always disaggregate everything for every data point? Or do we look for specific identities, and who sets a priority, and is that enough? Is that okay? So we need to talk about that. As institutions, we need to name those and set priorities, and have plans, and then integrate those things. That's something I've worked with institutions that different pockets will make commitments with external organizations and partners, but they never share that. Or that was, with this one college or this one program. And even though we set, institutional targets around specific student populations and graduation outcomes, we never share that with the rest of the institution. And then program evaluation is not using those established benchmarks. But largely we can be working with students to help balance the power dynamics and keep them and their perspective at the center, and really discouraging people going with their gut. We have too much data. The idea of, that we need to collect more data, no, we're fine. We got tons. We need to start using that data, and we need to start using it a lot more intentionally, and using it as a way, back to Divya's point of, we have this opportunity to use assessment to elevate marginalization and equity issues that exist with program evaluation, with assessment, with our student populations, that sometimes institutional leadership is so concerned with certain metrics and rankings that they're looking at this aggregate number, which could be okay, or could be decent next to the school down the street, but it's still a disservice to all of our students and our populations. And there's so much more we can be doing with how to approach those questions, and even then thinking about conceptually our learning outcomes and what that represented, the language that's written in, is that even understood by students? Are we even contextualizing for them that we have these frameworks and these connections from course learning outcomes all the way up to university learning outcomes, and how student affairs activities fit in? We can be doing a much better job prioritizing and working and partnering with students to use their language, and not that so instead of having to translate things to students, we start with them from the beginning and use their language so that they understand what skills, knowledge, and abilities they're going to get from a student activity or an internship experience or their capstone class, and largely letting them into the process so that they can be our partners in this process, so that we're not just using them as subjects of study, but
this is the co-creation we mentioned very early on.
Actually partnering with them to be co-collaborators in their learning experience, because that's what they should be doing.
Wonderful, wonderful. There's, again, so much more. I'm a little overwhelmed with all the things that maybe we could be doing, but let's add a little bit more, because the beauty of this is people can back it up and re-listen. They can pause the video and rewatch it. They can come back to it. And all of our podcasts, the transcripts are available on the site. So you can come back to this, right? But Gavin and Divya, what would you add to this? What jumps to mind is more things that we can integrate into practice? Divya?
So I want to share with those folks, Keith, including you, for anyone who's, who gets a little overwhelmed listening to social justice work, right? Because there's just so much. Like it's like peeling an onion, right? Like the more you peel, the more your eyes burn and you're crying and you realize like how bad it is, and you still have to continue cutting the onion, but it is like we are so entrenched in these ways that every time we peel, there is like loss, and there is, because it's not familiar and there's pain. So just know that it's not an all or nothing game, that we can make progress. So I want to share that. And then I want to share two other things. So one thing that I talk about in my chapter, and it's a tweet, and I don't know who the original, creator of the tweet is, but Kayla Reed tweeted in 2016. She defined like an ally. She said, an ally, A, for always center the impacted, L, for listen and learn from those who live in oppression. The second L is leverage your privilege, and the Y is yield the floor, right? And I talk about this in the chapter as well, my chapter. And it's this idea, going back to Ciji and Joe's point, center your students, like invite student voice, begin from their lived experiences, create opportunities. Again, like I say, like I'm one woman of color on this panel right now, and are there ways in which we can bring other colleagues of color on and get them to have the voices, get students to have their voices. So wherever we have privilege, we invite people along, as Gavin pointed out in the beginning, like how he's trying to bring people together and showcasing their work. So there's always room to learn. So I wanted to say that. And the second thing that I want to say in response to everything that Ciji and Joe mentioned about the how is it's something that I've written, co-written in the last chapter, but it's this idea, it's a tentative framework that we've offered to the readers. It's around this idea of you have equity arenas. So when you think about assessment, doing the work, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's in your student success programming or school to college transition, college readiness, wherever it may be, whether it's in academics or student affairs, think about those are different arenas. Your syllabus is an arena, your program evaluation is an arena, your teaching is an arena, right? Your programming, student programming is an arena. If you think of those as arenas, and if you think of all of us as equity actors who have an opportunity to act on equity, then think about the anchors. And the anchors is where like the meat is. Your anchors, and I've shared 4 anchors basically. So one is community. So find your community of people who give you ideas and help you get moving. The second thing is time, right? To what Ciji and Joe were saying, they were like, do this and do this and do this. And the first question that comes, like, but how? Like, there's no time. There's this deadline. And even in the classroom, when we say, get to know your students, oh, I don't have time. I have so much of stuff to, I can't extend a deadline. I can't do this and I can't do that. We have these meetings and we have accreditation. And I would say, like, if we can get off that hamster wheel and really, again, why are we doing this, right? Take a step back. We are doing this for student success. So if we're doing this for student success, is all of this stuff really important on the left side? Like I'm circling my hands if anyone's not listening and not watching, but or do we want to pay attention to what's important, and then focusing on that why will really help you anchor that time and say, I want to spend 10 minutes getting to know my students, in these ways, and at least do that to then influence my curriculum and my syllabus, all of that. So that's the second one. So community, time, communication, to Ciji and Joe's point, that such an important part. We don't communicate so many things about intention, about impact, about use. When we complain, like nobody is engaged, nobody's taking our surveys, because we've not communicated that we use your surveys to make this improvement. And so what you say has impact, right? So communication and communicating with each other, right? Expectations around deadlines. Why is it important? And what happens if you plagiarize? How does this impact other students? Or, things like that. So communication. And then the last thing I go back to again, there is foundational literature by Native, and I'm a feminist, so I'm going to say feminist scholars, that's who shaped my work, but by Native scholars, women of color scholars, immigrant scholars, Black scholars, Latinx scholars. There's just so much of research work If you start reading, oh my God, like I said, you'll have those aha moments of, oh, now I see exactly what's happening. Oh, now I see how my own thinking and approach to this building the survey design is problematic. So just that reading and being in community and learning from each other is so important. So
yeah.
I
want to highlight something that I think you're pointing to, but has come up throughout this conversation from the very beginning, is avoiding perfectionism, where we're talking about compliance versus betterment perspectives on doing this. All of these tools, all of these ways, all of the different ways we could disaggregate the data, right? It sort of feels like we can go down the rabbit hole, but Tema Okun points out that perfectionism is a key component of white supremacy culture. And sort of we have to get it right and have all the answers before we move forward. Let's push past that and let's do this thing and add this thing. And next time we'll do this and we'll add it in. And that betterment mentality, the avoiding perfectionism, I think is something that I've heard from all of you in different ways. Gavin, what would you add here before we move to our final question, as we're already running out of time?
So I've got three things. First of all, is set up the system so we can do this work. I think disaggregation of data is the most basic thing we should do, it's necessary almost all the time. But as we learned on my campus, I sit on our data equity team, that we don't even have the good data for that. We realized when we started to disaggregate our graduation data, we only had 60% of our students we only had race and ethnicity data for 60% of our students, because that came from the application process. And I can understand why some students wouldn't want to share that. And then also we have sex, we don't have gender. And so even the disaggregation of data can be limited by the structures we have. And so we need to examine that and figure out how to change those. And so we're having discussions on our campus of how we gather the data in addition to the application process, so we can get more data from more students, but also broader data. And I think examine the unexamined. What I really didn't think a lot about until I read more about indigenous knowledge systems is how the Western paradigm, or at least the European paradigm, has built into our education system. And just our focus on cognitive learning primarily. And in terms of more so in the classroom, but how writing is the primary way we have students demonstrate their learning, and just how limiting that is. And there are just multiple dimensions of learning and of our holistic self that are not built into the US, and I would even say the British higher education system. And so do a little reading about an indigenous knowledge system, because once I did that, it really kind of blew my mind, and like, oh wow, like there's a lot more out there that, and the way our systems are set up, we're not exposed to any of that. And so we've got to do that ourselves. And then also in regard to examining the unexamined, assess our practices and our policies, not just our programs and our outcomes. So I talk about this as being deconstructed assessment, because the power and oppression is built into our systems. They're built into our structures. And we can, to really use assessment to advance equity, we want to take a look at assessing actually some of those practices and policies. A quick example is the late fee for students who don't pay their bills. So on my campus, students cannot actually register for a class and start the class until they pay their full bill. And we also add these late fees on. So first of all, think about the fact that if you have even a small bill, you can't register. That's inequitable. And the other issue is we keep on adding these late fees on. The whole concept is that we provide this penalty that students will pay their bills. Well, let's just take a second to think about this and take what Ann Lundquist calls an equity pause. Which students are not paying those bills? Well, our students who don't have the money to pay the bills. So not only are we dispossessing them of the education, we're burying them in more debt. And the one thing that really upsets me most about U.S. higher education, it's one of the few commodities that you can pay for, and you don't get anything until you get the degree. And so that in and of itself is, a structural limitation. And so really think about, how do we begin to examine these unexamined pieces? And there's these oppressive systems aren't set up intentionally, they're just embedded into our society and the way we think. And then the last thing is really exciting, what we talked a little bit about already. Don't be overwhelmed. Thinking about equity itself can be overwhelming. Thinking about assessment, for most everybody except those of us on this
for most student affairs professionals, just assessment can be overwhelming. Yes.
Right. So that's a ton. And so I think just start with awareness of the 3 Ps: your power, your privilege, and your positionality. And as Ciji said, how that it can impact all the work we do, not just our assessment. And just start small And then you can continue to build on that, Keith, as you had mentioned as well.
Yeah. Well, we can tell you're a great teacher, Gavin, because you took all of this and cooked it down to the 3 P's. Really mnemonic, easy to remember, easy to manage, not that that's all easy to do, but you've really helped us think about this. Well, we are running out of time, which we knew we would. But this podcast is called Student Affairs Now. And we like to end just by inviting our guests to share just what do you think about or pondering or troubling now. It might be related to something someone said here or this conversation, or it might just be something in higher education or in your world that you're really pondering. And also, if folks want to connect with you and you'd like to offer up a place where folks can connect with you, you can go ahead and add that in as well. Joe, we're going to start with you. What are you troubling now?
For me, I've had the good fortune of working at a number of institutions that have served adult learners. And so the thing that troubles me is the vast majority of institutions that do not. And the fact that things like credit for prior learning and prior learning assessment are not common in higher ed. It blows my mind. 39 million students have left without a credential. Who started higher ed, did not get a credential. 39 million. And we could easily be working to center students, acknowledge their lived experiences through established things like PLA that have professional organizations like CALE that provide resources and tips and handbooks and guides for students. And so many institutions just are not doing it. That it's shameful. And so much more we can be doing to truly center our students instead of holding up our systems, or as Gavin pointed out, it's we need to be evaluating our processes not for process sake but for students, and is this truly serving and putting the students at the center? Because if not, that's what we should push to the side. We should prioritize these things that are truly serving our students. Lately I've been active the most on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me there. During conference season, that's when I'm most active on Twitter. So happy to engage there as well.
Yeah, just the yearning you have. It is so close. It is right there. We could do it, and we're not. Just like, I feel the frustration. Ciji, what are you troubling now?
So I'm a first-gen student, and I grew up in abject poverty as the daughter of a single mother. And I had a period of time where my partner, who grew up pretty much the opposite end of that spectrum, in the upper 1%, and I were driving back and forth to New York from Michigan 7 and 8 times in a series of months for some family health things. And when in all of that commuting, we were going back out to this rural area of New York where I grew up, and he was like, I didn't realize how expensive it was to be poor.
Yes.
And that was a moment for him. Correct. Right. And so for me, I really, to follow Gavin's lead on the 3 things that I think about that I'm pondering is first, this is individual. Healthy, whole humans are not terrified by the idea of dismantling white supremacy. They see that it causes harm and they want that to stop for other humans.
And it causes harm to them as well.
Correct.
Yeah.
Right. And so how do we help each human who also happens to be an assessment practitioner, right? All humans in general, though, truly. How do we help each human be on their own journey to understand their path and the systems and structures that they're abiding within, and how to disrupt that? What I think about systems, so it's individual, it is processes, and it's systems. So individual, that's that level. Systems, it's things like what Joe and Gavin have hinted at of students also will stop out, be trying to get their transcript so that they can continue somewhere else and have to pay to get it. So not only do I not have an ROI, but I've got to give you more of something I already don't have, which is how I got in this situation, to get what I did accomplish from you. And how that's just really counter to the mission of education. So why are we doing that? And so, there's lots of movements to get rid of that. And I think that those are the types of things that assessment can really help to unearth, is to examine which processes we engage in. Assessment itself being one of those processes that can cause harm or can advance wholeness and wellness for humans. And that last part is, again, those systems, right? So we think about where's their power. There's often power in accreditation and program review. So instead of just saying disaggregate your data by academic program, it's what is the expectation that they are doing something with that. So I think that's where we can go further, especially in like the accreditation realm. Is like, it's not enough to just look at the numbers and have a discussion. What is the action plan that follows? And that is what you will be held accountable for in the next accreditation cycle. So I think about what are the systems at play that can really support moving us in this direction of equity.
Wonderful. Gavin, what do you want to add? What's troubling you these days?
I'm thinking about the antecedents to this work and what Ann and I talk about in terms of individual and organizational readiness. Because as somebody who holds a lot of privileged identities, I had to do a lot of self-work to get to this point and really kind of battle myself and try to understand, in what ways have I potentially caused harm in the way I've been doing assessment, because I haven't been considering these, and I never stepped outside of my positionality. And so I think that can be some difficult work, because we can confront some really troubling things. And so I think there needs to be that individual awareness first and that individual readiness. But the next thing is, how do we scale this up? Because as we've all mentioned, this is about systems, and we have to dismantle the systems, but we also have to create systems that will engage in equity-centered assessment. And that's not easy. Our office may be on board, but our department might not be, or our division might not be. I think student affairs folks are going to be a little bit more ready than some of the academic affairs folks that I talk with. But how do we really do some organizational development so we can build that organizational readiness? Because if we do this in pockets, it's not going to be successful, or at least on a minor level. So we really need to figure out how to scale that. So that's what's really kind of troubling me, is how do we do this? Because as you said, Keith, people are going to be on board with this. There are very few people are going to say, no, I don't agree with this. And now they're coming up with different, NOLA is coming up with some examples, case studies, the book has some examples, there are more and more things coming out. So people are going to say, now I can see how this is done. But the next step is, how do we scale this up to really make some big change? So those are the things that I'm concerned about at this point. And probably the easiest way to reach me is at my email address, which is ghenning@nec.edu. Or if you forget that, just go to the New England College website, click on directory, and just search for Gavin, because I am the only Gavin at New England College.
That's the beauty of being at a smaller place.
I forgot to share my contact information.
Go ahead, Ciji.
I'm on LinkedIn. I'm not rarely on Twitter anymore. On LinkedIn, but also cg.heiser@gmail.com. It won't get caught by this is an external email filter that my institution has.
That's great. Well, and Gavin, you're reminding me of something I heard Reverend Dr. Jamie Washington say a long time ago. I'm hearing people who are using the words, but they haven't done the work. And I think that's something to explore. It's not just having the language and the lingo and being up to date, but you're pointing to a lot of the self-work and reflection, engagement, and really unlearning, right? That's really the task there. Divya, what are you troubling now?
I'll actually share my contact details first, and then I'll get to it.
Sure.
So you can reach me on LinkedIn. Again, it's Divya Bheda. You can search for me there. And then it's divyabheda@gmail.com. That's a safe spot to always reach me. And what I'm troubling actually are a few things. So one is I'm troubling the profession in terms of education as a whole, right? As educators, what do we need to do? How do we need to prepare our graduate students to be the next generation of educators? We want assessment to be a skill that everyone has, but it shouldn't be, oh, we have only time for assessment. We don't really have time for equity. Or we have time only for equity, we don't have time for assessment. It's a both and, it's not an either or. And so we need to really be doing some intentional to all the graduate programs out there, to all the graduate students out there. If you are not actively building your skills, because you don't want to come in as a faculty member or as a student affairs staff member leader, and then say, oh, I don't know how to engage in program evaluation in a way that matters to our students. So make sure you find your community, find us, reach out to us so that you can make a difference and you can do it as a collaborative. So that's one. The second thing is I want to go, take off at that collaborative. You don't have to do this alone. Again, higher ed is built on siloed thinking. It's built on capitalist structures, on that perfectionism, Keith, that you talked about. It's built on this idea that you have to do things this way to be recognized. We give individual accolades, individual performance improvement, individual everything. it doesn't have to be that way. So if we can come together where we do things where there's power in numbers, that's really important. So find that community where you can exchange ideas and take the work forward. And then the last thing that I would say is this work can be really overwhelming, right? As we've all, it's hard work. So when it's overwhelming, lately I've been paying more attention to my needs. And so anytime that you see, as you understand your power, positionality, the privilege that you have, look at those around you. And anytime that you can support, uplift those who are in need, please do that. Invite people into spaces that they wouldn't be invited to. And then pay attention. If you are a person of color, if you are dealing with spaces where you are feeling oppressed, where you're trying to advance equity, where you're facing a lot of resistance, know that there are other spaces out there that are 10 steps ahead, right? That they can give you the literature, that they can give you the strategies, that they can give you subversive, creative, all of that information that can move you forward in ways. And pay attention to your body. Like now more than ever, pay attention to your body, engage in that self-care, and share the load. Like say, I need help, and 5 other people need to be there. And a good colleague told me this: never lose an opportunity where there is student unrest. Build on that opportunity to move the needle even further, right? Democracy in assessment and education is really important right now. Student learning outcomes around life skills, around communication skills, essential skills, which was primarily the focus of student affairs. That's what's important right now. That's what's the key thing that's being talked about. So come together and make magic like you always do. We are here to support you. Please reach out to us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thanks all. This has been terrific. I really want to thank all 4 of you for your contributions and your conversations today, and the other editors of the book and the many other authors who contributed to this volume. Thanks to those of you who are here. I also want to thank our sponsors today, Stylus and Simplicity. Stylus is proud to be a sponsors of Student Affairs Now. Browse their student affairs, diversity, and professional development titles at styluspub.com, including this book. Use promo code SANOW for 30% off all books, plus free shipping. You can find them on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, and Twitter at Stylus Pub. And Simplicity. Simplicity is the global leader in student affairs and student services technology platforms with state-of-the-art technology that empowers institutions to make data-driven decisions specific to their goals. A true partner to the institution, Simplicity supports all aspects of student life, including but not limited to career services and development, student conduct and well-being, student success, and accessibility services. To learn more, visit simplicity.com or connect with them on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. As always, a huge shout out to Nat Ambrosi, the production of the assistant behind the podcast, who does all the behind the scenes work to make us all look and sound good. And if you're listening today and not already receiving our weekly newsletter, please visit our website at studentaffairsnow.com. Scroll to the bottom of the homepage to add your email to our MailChimp list. While you're there, check out our archives. I'm Keith Edwards. Thanks again to our fabulous guests today and to everyone who is listening and watching. Please make it a great week. Thanks all.